I want to get back to the point about contact lists, because that is, over the last few months, been a very hot topic, especially for communications app. Now, there's a difference between access, collecting, and sharing. Now, imagine if any app that you were going to use to communicate, your contact list was segregated off, so the apps couldn't access it at all. It was just, it's your address book, and you would have to re-enter into every app, every contact you have in your contact list. Maybe you have 200 contacts, maybe you have 500 contacts. You know, those apps probably wouldn't have 75% growth because it would just be too much of a pain to if you couldn't easily import your contact list. Now, there's a question of accessing it, storing it, and then sharing it. The three very different concepts. I remember when we had this conversation at Text Plus, we always decided we were going to let people opt out of any of this. We don't store the information, and I know other app developers have been caught into this, and people think, oh my God, these app developers are accessing my contact list. From an app developer's perspective, especially a communications app, we're trying to help you communicate. We're trying to help you communicate with your friends, and your device itself has all your friends in it. Now, does that mean that we should store it? Does that mean we should sell that information? Of course not. Should we give you the ability to tell us that you don't want us to do that? Yes, of course. But should the contact list be segregated off and not accessible? I guess it's possible a platform could be developed where the contact list was separate and could be accessed by app developers, but it may provide for apps with minimal functionality that you're not going to want to use. So this has to be weighed. I think there's some degree of overreaction with this particular issue. From an app developer's perspective, we look at it and we say, we're not doing anything with this data. We're not interested, but we understand consumers' perspective. When we had this discussion up front, we thought, well, let's give people an opt-out. Let people decide, you know what, I don't want to import my contact list into your app until I've used it for a while. Then once I have some trust with your company, then I'll give you access to my contacts. And I think that's completely reasonable.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good approach. And what he just said is kind of a thinking through of that issue. And I think that contact lists are a red flag. You should just know that right now. There is a kind of thing that happens in privacy where you'll have an issue. The issue is understood by some, misunderstood by others. And once that little tension arises, it becomes a hot button issue. Contact lists are that right now. Now, I think that you found a really nice balance. So that's, I think, really good. I think there's a couple of issues we haven't talked about. One is hashing data after you get it. That really helps. Get rid of the identifiability if you don't need to be combining it and whatnot, and store it off someplace and segregate it. There's a lot of provisions in the law that provide for increased freedom with data as soon as you anonymize it, or I should say de-identify it to some degree. That's a better term. The second thing I would say is that, look, if you're going to need the addresses and whatnot, offer an opt-out. It's an incredibly important feature, and be really upfront about that. And I think that people like that, and people trust that more. Sometimes it's just simply about communicating, and where there's a lack of communication, there's a lack of trust. Communicate more, not less. And let people reverse their decisions. I think, you know, the opt-out really does that.
Oh, and we had to discuss this because there were alternative apps that didn't ask permission, that didn't provide an opt-out, and I had people looking at me saying, why are we doing this? There are 6 competitive apps that don't do this. You launch it, your contacts are, wow, already in the app, you can start communicating with it. It's so much better. People want to communicate with this. And we had to say, no, this is going to blow up sooner or later, and we want to be on the right side of this. And providing consumer choice allows you to get there. And one was not accessing it without your permission, and then not storing it at all. We don't store it at all. All we do is we simply bounce it. We associate our information with whatever your contact list to provide it within the app, but we don't store it on our servers at all. So we don't have access to it. We can't sell it because we don't store it at all. It's just locally on your device.
Sean?
Yeah, I think the middle ground is exactly what you're talking about, which is as long as the user has the ability to choose whether to do it or not. That's important. I think this needs to happen at the platform layer. This needs to be a requirement that Apple and Google put into their platforms, where if you're going to access that contact list, Apple can do this, Google can do this. make it so that the user has to be informed about it, has to actually accept that their contact list is being addressed.
Sure.
If it's at the platform layer, then users trust that the app makers are all respecting their privacy in this regard because they have to.
And arguably, we already do this with location.
Right.
So,
exactly.
the platform level has a location opt-in, opt-out.
Yeah.
For me, actually, my contacts are more important than, where I am, in my car at any particular moment. in
That
time.
raises an interesting question, guys. Who's responsible for privacy?
Right.
Show of hands. Platforms. Apple, Google. Everybody.
Yeah.
Don't steal my thunder here.
Isn't it you?
Carriers. Anybody carriers? The Patriot Act guys. Developers. The guys who are actually building it. Even white label shops to some extent. How about the publishers? Content guys. Please put your hand up. All right, so a lot of hands went up on multiple answers. Like, what about the consumer?
Yeah.
And that's the last one, the user.
Yeah.
If your privacy policy does what it's supposed to do, and you're telling them in a conspicuous way with a reasonable font, just in time, and privacy by design, shouldn't you be okay?
Well, and you were bringing this up earlier, in this battle you're referring to, privacy versus security, the consumer gets caught in the middle. So, as a consumer, the technology, even for us as developers or security IT professionals, whatever, it already goes so fast for us, but for the consumers, socially engineering them to understand the risks is already difficult as it is. So, they are more afraid based on a higher level of information being fed to them as a as like a doomsday scenario of like somebody stealing their identity or their identity being stolen and information being distributed. They don't understand that. So, how do we help to socially engineer them without scaring them away from using our application?
Okay.
And so it's not necessarily we advocate for them or you advocate for them, but at the same time, it's important for them because you go back to 10, 15 years ago when the issue was you didn't really have a privacy issue, but people's long distance service, I don't know if you remember that, a lot of you probably do, but people's long distance service would be changed and they didn't really understand it, it would just happen. And so you have a scenario like that now where they don't really understand it, they just use it, but there's so much negative information out there, when you feed them a privacy policy, they just say too much information, did not read, and then you just, say, okay, yeah, we agree with it. But we want to say, we want you to read it. We want to simplify it. But the regulatory, the regulation behind it says you have to have this information, and it's huge. But as a consumer, most of the time they're not going to read it. So, how do we advocate for them and help to socially engineer them without compromising our ability to make money?
That little thing. Look, here's the deal. It's so important. I think I can't say it enough. Apps are an extraordinary opportunity for consumers and for privacy. I believe that because it allows what I call layered notices. You can have a very simple notice in an app that links to an actual website policy that's the 125 pages. This is a concept that has been catching on more and more, and the FTC, I think, is very supportive of it. I am too. I think it really works. I like the layered notice. I think, though, your question really gets at the heart of a lot of things. I think some of this is simply about having a dialogue. In the past 10 years, if you look at the dialogue between privacy advocates and the privacy community and the advertising community, it is just rife with really bad stuff, and it was a bad start. And I think that you guys are already on a really good track and having dialogues that never happened in the past iteration of the web. So I think that we have a real chance here. And I think something I wanted to mention in response to some of the things that have been said, there are Wild West cowboys out there using data in a way that would just shock and stun you, and everyone in this room is like a good guy, right? It's the rogue characters you've got to be careful of. There's, like, for example, medical apps that are collecting all sorts of medical data and selling them to direct marketing lists. It's really, like, repellent and disgusting. This is exactly what is like not good. But this kind of bad action would be happening on any technology, and it's been happening for, what, 100 years? It's just a different technology. Those aren't the guys we're talking about here. We're talking really about having best practices, communicating with consumers. I like your idea. I don't have all the ideas on how to implement it, but I just have to tell you, I think that a mobile app has the most opportunity for educating consumers than we've seen on any other platform to date. Jim, what do you think about that?
No, I think that's right. I think there's a huge, sorry.
I think there's a huge opportunity.
All right. Yeah, we've gotten through 2 of the questions that I had on my list of 20. So we can either all settle in, or I'd like to turn it over to audience questions as well. Make sure that we're talking about things that you guys want to talk about. So there was a question in the back?
Yeah, I did have a question. I just wanted to start off by saying one thing. Large EULAs scare me.
Yeah.
Basically, if I see an app and there's a huge EULA or end user license agreement at the beginning, I'm going to be wary of it if it's that's the same program that I've used before, I've seen other people use before without my check. So basically, if if a friend of mine says, hey, you should try out this app, does this whole bunch of stuff, and it hits me with a huge EULA with freaking 18 huge paragraphs, I'm not going to want to trust that app because it requires so much information for me to go through.
But you have a credit card though, right? Have you seen the credit card and end user license agreement, your contract? And your credit card company knows much more about you. It knows everything you do with your credit card. So I'm not saying that long EULAs are a good idea and that they should certainly be written in plain English. I just don't think that mobile EULAs specifically are any more problematic than anything else. I think there are, this is a nascent industry we're talking about an identifier and some non-personally identifiable information potentially. There's certainly bad actors out there, and they threaten us good guys. And so, we agree when there are bad actors out there that they should be looked at. Sometimes the problem is, though, you got back to this point, when you get big enough, the bad actors kind of scurry around the bottom, and the big actors spend a lot of time worrying about this stuff, and the smaller guys actually don't, getting them investigated is hard enough because they're too small, and they pop up, and they're in Manila, and then they're in Miami, and then they're, in Mexico. So,
well, what about to Dennis's point? I mean, when we put the pop-up that requests permissions for Facebook in plain English, we lose 75% of the base, but we don't want the long EULA as well.
I'm sorry, I wrote that policy.
Well, it's not so much
Your bank accounts are suffering because of my activities. I apologize.
The problem isn't in the EULA. The problem is the fact that there are so many app developers out there. You have no idea who they are, and that's the trust that needs to be built first. Kind of to give an example of a bad actor on an app that that my wife downloaded for our kids. It's supposed to be this like create a name for a kid or something like that. And download the app. The first thing they ask you is, "What's your name?" Okay, now what's your mother's maiden name? All right, what's her birthday? You're kind of like, oh man. I mean, we saw that and we said, now something's wrong here, obviously. But the UI or apples and oranges, it looked like an app for a 2-year-old, but they just got right into the nitty-gritty of asking some crazy information. So there is definitely the consumer is a big part of it. With the big UIs and all of that, and to your question, a lot of that can be built in the user experience. The communication is key, as was mentioned earlier, and how you interact with your user is just as important. Throwing a big EULA up front in a space where there are hundreds upon thousands of app developers out there, some in Manila, some good guys like us in this room, I'd be wary myself. But you can do things as a part of the user experience. So if you require registration, if you require access to a contact list or something, you can say right up front, do this, here's what we're going to give you, and here's what we're not going to do. There's various gaming companies out there that require registration upon login now. 5 years ago, how many people here have more than one email address? How many people have a junk email address? And for that reason, email used to be the big security thing. So nowadays, you say, hey, give us your Facebook, give us your Twitter, or give us your email, and right up front, people will say, we will only use your email for password retrieval. We will do nothing else with it. I feel a little more comfortable giving you my email address now. You state that in plain English up front, and you can build those type of things into your user experience just to build that relationship with the user as you try to build more features down the line. That's a nice way of growing without necessarily losing that 75%. And it's not Facebook's fault that there are bad actors out there. Their stuff is in plain English, but just because they download our app, they know they're not necessarily dealing with Facebook. So
Nice job, Tim. Plain English.
You're welcome.
One thing, we've been talking about privacy, there's also a difference between privacy and anonymity. There seems to be a push now towards letting people be anonymous in apps. And talking to Tim, I would wonder what would happen if, and as an app developer, we need to deal with the platforms, and the platforms set the rules by which we operate. There are platforms, there's one platform in particular that says, you cannot require an end user to provide you with user information upon registration. That's in their policy. Now, it may not be applied evenly across different apps, but imagine if Facebook couldn't ask for an email address as part of your login process, as part of your registration. Now, would that have created an issue? Meaning, you could set up a Facebook account. We didn't have to validate you at all. Tell me who you are. You can pretend to be whoever you are. You can communicate with any of our users and check out anybody on Facebook. And if we try to find you, we have no idea who you are because we don't have even an email address on it.
You'd be MySpace.
Yeah. Well, we've learned. I mean, so this is where we talk about privacy and security, and they should be together. But they really are. MySpace had issues with child predators, and if they didn't have an email address on somebody, parents groups would say, "Oh my God, you're operating this platform, and you don't know who your users are." And now we're saying, well, we want users to be private. There's a difference between having privacy and making sure your data is being collected and used properly, and being anonymous. And certain tools that were used for purposes of validation, be it a UDID, be it an email address, these are common sense things that, I don't know that a mobile game necessarily needs to have it, but a communications platform, a social platform that lets strangers interact, there you need to be able to know who your users are. It's an important part because when law enforcement calls you and says, hey, we had a complaint about a 14-year-old girl, we as a company take that seriously. We take privacy seriously, but we also take the security and safety of our users very seriously. And when our users can communicate with the outside world via SMS to people who aren't even using our service, then we really have to be careful. So again, something to consider.
Can I respond to
issue.
Sorry. No, please go ahead.
He just mentioned MySpace. One of the other issues of MySpace was malicious code. Not necessarily email address, but privacy concerns regarding, and that's one of their biggest downfalls from a privacy perspective, is any advertisement could be run on their site and offer some malicious code. In March, NC State actually did a study of 100,000 apps on Android and found hundreds of different ad libraries, including, you may recognize them, Socio and Mobus, that they were actually ad libraries that could be integrated into applications that people could develop that were getting information that the application developer didn't necessarily know about. I believe that Socio was one of the ones that they were getting a recent phone list of users and actually sending that to the internet. Some applications were using APIs that could take your phone number and send it. I think Mobus was actually scanning for SMS messaging and finding the source of that SMS messaging and from that study. So it becomes kind of a MySpace effect, right? Where the developer doesn't necessarily know that they're being malicious, but they're adding ad libraries that are doing things that they're unaware of. So.
Well, and that's the difference between Android and iOS. Generally speaking, Android is much more open. I don't know. I mean,
Yes.
I became aware of something like this because there was some library on some Android device that was using Text Plus to send information. Now, it wasn't available through Text Plus. It was simply it had a Text Plus phone number as the recipient. So it said, find this information and send a text message to this phone number, which happened to be us. We became aware of it. We immediately called the LA FBI. and let them know about it. And so I'm not sure if it's the exact same, but Android is open. I mean, that library could have come in through any, it could have come in through any number of, it could have been downloaded as part of some other application that the user doesn't even know about. It's a question of how closed or how open.
Well, it's not necessarily open like open.
And I'm not an engineer, so.
Yeah. Not open like open source, but they don't test their apps.
Right.
There's no.
Yeah, there's no. I mean,
yeah.
it's more of a,
Wild West was a good word.
There's not a. It's more Wild West. There's not a validation, and Apple as much as a closed infrastructure where you have to go through submission process, and they need to approve you, and they go through the code.
Yeah, I think the higher level of that was just, the consumer, it being specifically to Android and the ability to do that, but the fact that the consumer, the developer doesn't necessarily know because they don't do their due diligence, they don't do their testing, whereas us in this room and the collective there are more responsible for this type of things, will be aware of those types of things. But even if you're aware, much that MySpace may have been aware, they did not realize that their advertising partners were using malicious code to, install Trojans and that sort of thing. So,
Can I say a quick word about the role of unique IDs? And this is any form of unique ID. I spoke at a hearing at the FTC last week. I was invited to speak on the mobile privacy panel, and the issue of unique IDs came up. And I said, the person from a mobile developer, mobile app folks said, look, we collect unique IDs all the time. It's not a big issue, and it's not a unique identifier, really. And I said, oh, yes, it is. And look, a consumer can't walk down the street and shouldn't be expected to opt in or opt out of all this stuff. There's got to be a better way. And I promoted apps as a way of really managing the opt-in, opt-out process for collecting unique IDs. And I still think that that's a real good potential there. But I have to tell you, the FTC has a lot of language and a lot of reports on unique IDs. And the fact that unique IDs in the FTC's parlance are really considered a form of personally identifiable information, or the ubiquitous PII. And I believe that that's the direction they're going to move with unique IDs in the mobile app space. I really believe that. I believe that very much, especially based on that hearing. And given that, what does that mean for all of you? And I think that that's a question that really needs to be thought through. Are you going to collect those? If you collect them, are you going to hash them? What are you going to do? That's an issue like a contact list. I would encourage you to really work through very carefully.
All right, we're going to take another question.
So how much attention do developers based in the United States attention do they have to pay to international laws and regulations? It's a big issue in places like Germany and France and collecting these things. What is the bare minimum that people here need to know and understand if someone happens to have their app on their phone?
So there's a couple ways to deal with this. One is that a company, at least now, can join something called the EU-US Safe Harbor Program and certify through the Department of Commerce, the US Department of Commerce, that you're in compliance with US law. And in doing so, you are shielded in some ways as a company from legal liability for some of the responsibilities that other jurisdictions around the world would impose on your company. But as a practical matter, if your app is being downloaded in jurisdictions other than in the United States, almost in fact, every country that I know about around the world has a privacy commissioner, is a federal official, a head of government official who has true prosecutorial authority in those foreign jurisdictions. Canada, Mexico, the EU, everywhere in South America, almost every Asian country. And irrespective of whether or not you're in compliance with the EU-US Safe Harbor, you should expect that if you're not in compliance, or they can claim, they being the privacy commissioners, that you were not in compliance with the laws of their jurisdiction, and that one of their citizens residing in their country was offended by your actions as a company, you can expect to have a nastygram sent to you. And so there really is very little protection right now. This is one of the great questions that's being debated in Washington, and one of the things the App Developers Alliance is going to be working on is how do we help create sort of multilateral, cross-jurisdictional understandings so that you can build one company with one set of policies and one set of technologies instead of having to have fine gradations and modifications for your people downloading your apps around the world.
We're working on it. That's the short answer. Let's take
That's why he's the communications guy.
Yeah, one more question.
So I make apps for children, like really small children, like 3, 4, 5 years old, and so this is all kind of new to me because the things that I make are like storybooks, and people don't, you don't ask kids, put your name in, link it up with your Facebook, you don't do that sort of thing for children. But just this morning I was on like the forums for this site called Moms with Apps. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but Moms with Apps. And so apparently there's like this movement going on between developers who make apps for really little kids to come up with some sort of standardized graphic that you can put on your site, like a privacy policy graphic.
I saw that.
Yeah, I just read about that this morning, and so it seemed like I wasn't sure if I want to get people's your
Pam,
opinions
can I
on
take
it.
this one for a second? So Moms with Apps was a co-sponsor of an event similar to this one that we did in Palo Alto about a month ago, and they're great. One of the things that they're talking about is badges.
Yeah,
which is
that's what I was looking at.
In the conversation, I'm having to resist making a Cheech and Chong joke. One of the conversation last night that we had with the FTC is that there is no clear imagery that you as developers can incorporate into your UX that doesn't totally screw up your app, right? There's a sort of it has to be comprehensive, it has to be in time, it has to be conspicuous, but it doesn't say how large the font has to be, what color, the whatever, and so on and so on. It's a pretty gray area. And their hope is that on something as sensitive as child apps, and particularly aimed at children, they can say, here are your 5 badges. Right? Here, 3 to 5, 5 to 8, 8 to 10, 12 and higher. And they can give you those tools so as a developer you can slap that on. I think it's a good idea. We think it's a good idea. We think it's a good idea beyond kids, but particularly on the third rail, child apps. It's not a bad idea, and they're great people to work with.
What I was reading this morning was that it seemed like a lot of developers, like one developer sort of made a set of standardized icons, like one icon for like this has in-app purchases, this has like location services, this has social, and then a lot of developers were sort of making their own versions of it. Like, and I got so into this morning, I was kind of designing my own thing, and then I showed it to some people, and they said, well, we'd rather have one standardized thing that everyone has. Exactly.
So part of our mission, part of the Gas Alliance mission, is to stabilize and standardize without slowing down the dynamic growth of the industry. Right? We don't ever want the apps bubble to burst. And part of that is figuring out what can be standardized and what should be left the hell alone. And our feeling is that regulation in general is bad. Right? That it's important to have guidelines, it's essential to have best practices, it's very important to have the FTC, to have the SEC, Department of Commerce, and Congress involved in the process. But that you guys are innovators. You'll innovate your way towards better customer service, toward better privacy policies, and that those privacy policies will then inform regulation, which is good for everybody. So the badges, right, should be created by developers. They should be designed by designers, and then incorporated across platforms. Let me ask one more question before we hit the bar, before it closes. How many people are scared, or at least worried? Just 1, 2, 3,
Absolutely.
4, 5, all right, 6, 7, 8.
In general?
Of another siren.
At the bar,
What is the bar? All right, let's go. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.